Binder, you are a reporter that covers misinformation, right? Like you're pretty good at that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes, I do cover misinformation.
You do from the right.
Right. And not just from the right, honestly. It's all over the place now.
Apparently in the New York Times. Apparently in the New York Times.
Right. Yeah.
So if you'll allow me, I would like to do a deep dive into this incredible piece written by friend of the show, for many friends of the show, the team over there at The Intercept, Ryan Grimm, Murtaza, no, it wasn't Murtaza, I apologize. It's not a friend of the show there, but not on this piece. Ryan Grimm, Jeremy Scahill, and Daniel Boguslaw had this bombshell report, honestly, where they did a deep dive into the cover story on October 7th and the alleged mass rape that occurred on October 7th against Israelis by Hamas. Now, when I first read that initial report, there's some red flags about the lack of first-person testimony, much of it being fairly vague, but at the time, you have to assume in an attack like this that many kinds of violence are perpetrated, and sexual violence is quite common in wartime. You can obviously not rule out that Hamas committed sexual violence on October 7th. You can't rule it out after this explosive report by The Intercept going into what the New York Times was alleging. You can't rule it out either, but this at the very least casts immense doubt on the claims that were made in this piece that wasn't just a one-off. It was on the front page of the Times, and it was published at a time when public opposition to Israel's assault on Gaza was mounting, and it had clearly a strategic purpose. And so for those who are not familiar at this point, let's put this piece up on the screen. This is what Ryan, Jeremy Scahill, Daniel Boguslaw wrote up. It's called Between the Hammer and the Anvil, and I'd encourage everybody to read this full piece behind the New York Times October 7th expose. Let's start here. Anat Schwartz had a problem. The Israeli filmmaker and former Air Force intelligence official had been assigned by the New York Times to work with her nephew, Adam Sella, and veteran Times reporter Jeffrey Gettleman on an investigation into sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th that could reshape the way the world understood Israel's ongoing war on the Gaza Strip. By November, global opposition was mounting against Israel's military campaign, which had already killed thousands of children, women, and the elderly. On her social media feed, which the Times has since said it's reviewing, Schwartz liked a tweet saying that Israel needed to, quote, turn the Strip into a slaughterhouse. Violate any norm on the way to victory, read the post. Those in front of us are human animals who do not hesitate to violate minimal rules. The New York Times, however, does not have rules, the New York Times, however, does have rules and norms. A bit of a Freudian slip by me there. Schwartz had no prior reporting experience. Her reporting partner Gettleman explained the basics to her, Schwartz said in a podcast interview on January 3rd, produced by Israel's Channel 12 and conducted in Hebrew. Gettleman said, she said, was concerned that they get at least two sources for every detail we put into the article, cross-check information, do we have forensic evidence, blah, blah, blah. She says, they were basically, Gettleman was directing her to find evidence that could be corroborated, that was strong. We'll get into why it's not strong whatsoever. But the reporter was directing her from afar, and this person who had zero reporting experience was doing the digging on the ground in Israel. Scroll down a bit. Schwartz said she was initially reluctant to take the assignment because she did not want to look at visual images of potential assaults and because she lacked experience to conduct such an investigation. Nonetheless, she began working with Gettleman on the story, she explained in the podcast interview. Gettleman, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, is an international correspondent, and when he is sent to a bureau, he works with news assistants and freelancers on stories. In this case, several newsroom sources familiar with the process said Schwartz and Sella did the vast majority of the ground reporting, while Gettleman focused on the framing and writing. The resulting report, published in late December, was headlined "Screams Without Words: How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th." It was a bombshell and galvanized the Israeli war effort at a time when some of Israel's allies were expressing concern over the large-scale killing of civilians in Gaza. Inside the newsroom, the article was met with praise from from editorial leaders, but skepticism from other Times journalists. The paper's flagship podcast, The Daily, attempted to turn the article into an episode, but it didn't manage to get through a fact check, as The Intercept previously reported. The fear among Times staffers who had been critical of the paper's Gaza coverage is that Schwartz will become a scapegoat for what is a much deeper failure. She may harbor animosity towards Palestinians, lack the experience with investigative journalism, and feel conflicting pressures between being a supporter of Israel's war effort and a Times reporter, but Schwartz did not commission herself and her nephew to report one of the most consequential stories of the war. Senior leadership at the New York Times did. Now let's pause there for a second, Binder. And what's your reaction to this as a reporter? Because this is, first of all, the New York Times is the paper of record. It's like the pinnacle of what many journalists feel their career could be. To be able to get a front page story, to be a co-author, to write a piece on this war, on this major international crisis, and no veteran reporter, no reporter on staff seemingly, no reporter who toiled over this was hired to be the point people for Gettleman in this report. It was two Israelis who were related familially and had no reporting experience to do such a thing. It's like, honestly, it's embarrassing for the paper in terms of like the meritocratic elements, but then just the process is so shockingly shoddy.
Right. It's a combination of everything. Like, I don't think, on its own, not having reporting experience means you can't, do an act of journalism, of very good, well done journalism. There are people out there who experience things, citizen journalists who, aren't professionals, who still have something that they've seen or, have a firsthand account of that is certainly valid and reportable and legit. But it's just a combination of everything. It's like they specifically sought out someone who seemingly has a very clear bias, again, on its own, not necessarily an issue, certainly something to be extra cautious about, but, still you can do good, legitimate, straightforward journalism and still have a personal bias on an issue. But clearly that's not what happened here. You have someone who went out to find facts, went out to find witness accounts, went out to find sources to corroborate what they were trying to find out and confirm, and they could not do that. They could not do that. And with the inability to do that, instead of deciding that there's a different story to tell or no story at all, they found what they could and seemingly misreported it, or at least contorted what was being said and laid it out. Like, the angle in which they laid it out in wasn't just like, here is a compilation of, what is being said in Israeli media, etc., from people who were, there on October 7th, who, again, these aren't people who experienced it.
Yes.
These are people with specific claims based on their firsthand, what they say is their firsthand account. They witnessed it. But then there are also, seemingly based on this Intercept report, holes in every single story which they pulled. Like, it's
crazy,
right? Yeah, like every single third party that they quoted in this story, which, again, the angle here, the way this story was promoted, the way this story was sold, is that this is it, the defining proof that this happened on October 7th, that there was systemic rape perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th. And there is that package that the story was sold as. That claim is not confirmed. It's just not. There are stories from people who were there on October 7th who say they saw this happen. And then when they tell it different times, it almost, I believe, every single instance.
I want to get to those details.
Their story changes every single time they tell it.
And the people who they get the information from are proven liars as well. Like, let's because you're hitting on so much of it. Like, the details in this are just shocking. Let's scroll to that part that Binder is referencing, where they begin to go through how she got her sourcing. But this is how, briefly, I'll read this section. In response to The Intercept's questions about Schwartz's podcast interview, a spokesperson for the New York Times walked back the Blockbuster's article's framing that evidence shows Hamas had weaponized sexual violence to a softer claim that there may have been systemic use of sexual assault. May have. You guys did a front page report. Page report on this. This is not just a statement to The Intercept. They need to do a full correction in the paper. 100%. This is not sufficient.
It's absolutely fair to say we can't prove this did or did not happen.
Right.
These are what people who were there are saying. This is also what they're saying every time they tell the story. It's possible that they witnessed this. It's possible they witnessed versions of this. It's possible they did not witness it, or, like in everything that was going on the ground on October 7th. They could have misconstrued something. They could, they've experienced the trauma. I'm sure things happen. You can't prove otherwise, though, that this did or did not happen. Yet New York Times, instead of doing a report, maybe that this is everything we know, and then present everything that we just mentioned here. No, instead they framed it as this is the definitive proof that this did 100% happen in this way. And that definitive proof does not exist. Even in the article itself, that definitive proof, no matter how much they tried to angle it that way, no matter how much the reporters' writing tried to contort the story in that way, even when they had to get down to the facts, they do not have a first-hand account. They do not have anything from someone who says, this happened to me. And they go around saying, why they could not have that, which is fine. That's totally legit to write that too. But then again, you do not have that definitive proof that the whole story was angled on. It's just there was,
and then it wouldn't be a front page story, and it wouldn't maybe even be the thrust of the story. It would be it would be in the fourth or fifth paragraph in another piece. Some secondhand claims of sexual assault have been made, but the New York Times could not independently verify it with a first person account. Instead, it was a front page headline story, extremely sensationalist. So this is where the evidence falls apart. Scroll down, Bradley, you'll see a photo, and this is where the beginning of the Intercept point by point breakdown.
I just want to add here, if anyone is listening to this and they're like, oh, this left wing show or whatever, blah 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 blah, they come across this, they're not a regular viewer or whatever, we are saying exactly what journalists with the New York Times' podcast, their main podcast, their bread and butter, their headline podcast, The Daily, they couldn't run a story on this because the journalists in that department at the New York Times, their own fact-checking process, which apparently is more rigorous than the one that the actual report had to go through itself, they could not. They couldn't run it because they said there was too many holes in the story. What the story was claiming was not there, so they did not run a story on this in The Daily.
That would be interesting to know who's the editor for The Daily versus who's the editor for the front page, and what are their differences and who do they answer to, because my guess is this comes from the top of the paper, because these kinds of decisions, this would not pass standard scrutiny anywhere else, any other major paper like this. But Schwartz began her work on the violence of October 7th, where one would expect, by calling around to the designated Room 4 facilities in 11 Israeli hospitals that examine and treat potential victims of sexual violence, including rape. First thing, I called them all, and they told me no complaint of sexual assault was received, she recalled in the podcast interview. I had a lot of interviews which didn't lead anywhere. Like, I would go to all kinds of psychiatric hospitals, sit in front of the staff, and all of them are fully committed to the mission, and no one had met a victim of sexual assault. The next step was to call the manager of the sexual assault hotline in Israel's south, which proved equally fruitless. The manager told her they had no reports of sexual violence. She described the call as a crazy, in-depth conversation where she pressed for specific cases. Did anyone call you? Did you hear anything? She recalled asking. How could it be that you didn't? So let me pause here for a second. This is already so many red flags here, Binder. This is a reporter in search of an already predetermined idea of what the story should be. She's fishing. She's fishing.
She's not following the facts. She's following preconceived notion, what her story to be. And then she sought out whoever would tell her what she wanted to hear, basically.
And that makes sense. Because she has no journalistic training. This is not something that a journalist would do if this were actually somebody who had reporting in their background.
And seemingly where she did find what she was looking for, it all comes from, or the majority of it comes from secondhand as well.
Yes.
Like, that's the thing. That's the extra thing on top of this all. Like, it's not like she herself found dozens or even a half dozen, people who were maybe at the music festival that was attacked on October 7th and sat down and spoke with each and every one of them. A lot of what she's reporting is secondhand through another media source or outlet. Some of it, from what I've seen, maybe even the majority of it, but I do know some of it. I would have to check the piece myself. But some of it, I recall, was biased in and of itself because they were from
I'm about to get to it.
Conducted interviews and stuff.
I'm about to get to it here.
State-funded media, it's like
an ultra-Orthodox group. Yeah, I just want to lay this out because, it is as insane as you say. Bradley, can we put this back up? As Schwartz began her own efforts to find evidence of sexual assault, the first specific allegations of rape began to emerge. A person identified in anonymous media interviews as a paramedic from the Israeli Air Force Medical Unit 669 claimed he saw evidence that two teenage girls at Kibbutz Nahal Oz had been raped and murdered in their bedroom. The man made other outrageous claims, however, that called his report into question. He claimed another rescuer pulled out of the garbage a baby who'd been stabbed multiple times. He also said he had seen Arabic sentences that were written on entrances to houses with the blood of the people that were living in the houses. No such messages exist, and the story of the baby in the trash can has been debunked. The bigger problem was that no two girls at the kibbutz fit the source's description. In further interviews, he changed the location to Kibbutz Be'eri, but no victims killed there matched the description either, as Mondoweiss reported. And then she doesn't seem to think this is questionable in any way. After seeing these interviews, Schwartz started calling people at Kibbutz Be'eri and other kibbutzim that were targeted on October 7th in an effort to track down the story. Nothing. There was nothing, she said. No one saw or heard anything. She then reached the Unit 669 paramedic who relayed to Schwartz the same story he had told other media outlets, which she says convinced her there was a systemic nature to the sexual violence. I said, okay, so it happened. One person saw it happen in Be'eri, so it can't just be one person because it's two girls, it's sisters, it's in the room. Something about the about this is systemic. Something about this feels to me that it's not random, Schwartz concluded on the podcast. Schwartz said she then began a series of extensive conversations with Israeli officials from Zaka, which has been proven to be, this is now me saying this, a lying organization time and time again. A private ultra-Orthodox rescue organization that has been documented to have mishandled evidence, including mishandled evidence and spread multiple false stories about the events of October 7th, including debunked allegations of Hamas operatives beheading babies and cutting the fetus from a pregnant woman's body. Its workers are not trained forensic scientists or crime scene experts. When we go into a house, we use our imagination, said Yossi Landau, a senior Zaka official describing the group's work at the October 7th attack sites. The bodies were telling us what happened. That's what happened. Landau was featured in the Times report, though no mention is made of his well-documented track record of disseminating sensational stories of atrocities that were later proven false. Schwartz said that in her initial interview, Zaka members did not make specific allegations of rape, but described the general conditions of the bodies they saw. They told me, yes, we saw naked women, or we saw a woman without underwear, both naked without underwear and tied with zip ties, and sometimes not zip ties, sometimes a rope or a string of a hoodie. Schwartz continued to look for evidence at various sites of attack and found no witnesses to corroborate stories of rape. And so I searched a lot of the kibbutzim, and apart from this testimony of the Israeli military paramedic and additionally here and there, Zaka people, the stories like didn't emerge from there, she said. Okay, so here we go.
There's so much here. Like, first of all, she admits in this like this also just shows like this is someone who has no idea what they're doing. That she went out there in a interview that was going to be published. Did she think because it was in Hebrew that no one outside of Israel would come across it? Or I mean, that's a possibility. Or
I mean, they do this all the time. Just briefly, Binder, like the Israeli officials say their most genocidal stuff in Hebrew because they literally bank on the fact that English outlets won't necessarily pick up on it.
Right, but this is something a little bit different, though. This is someone who put their work in an English. The work that she's talking about and the work that's being criticized is in it. The world's largest current events English speaking outlet, and she's either A, like you said, just thinks it's fair game because she's speaking to an Israeli outlet in Hebrew. Or B, she just fundamentally doesn't know that everything she just said calls into question everything she's done, her entire body of work here. The idea that she would just assume. Look, first of all, the assumption is, let's just take that one example she gave of like the two sisters or whatever, right? She said that she had heard secondhand that one of them was assaulted or sexually assaulted, and then that means that the other sister had to have been assaulted too.
They did not match the description of anybody at both of the kibbutzim that it was said to have taken place at, and the guy that said that changed his story twice.
Right. This is just not how it's done. It's just not how it's done. You don't just assume things. And then, of course, there's that other, that conservative group. What was it? Zaka, you said?
Yes.
I remember them. They were the ones early on who were giving credence to the beheaded babies
myth.
Myth that we know is not true.
And they also were the group that was seemingly complicit in not being forthright about the bodies post-October 7th of the Israelis that were killed, and did not immediately hand them over basically to investigators so that they could look into potentially how these folks died. Right.
Yeah, I mean, they admit that they just look at the scene and then they imagine what could have happened without any sort of forensic proof, without any sort of actual investigation. They just decide whatever they'd like to decide. And I mean, if you don't understand what the problem is with that in terms of creating manufacturing consent around, look at these horrendous things that these people did, we have to respond in kind, then I mean, I don't know what to say to you. Like, and also there's obviously a huge difference here between what's in that report and what we know for sure. Again, is it possible that we know people were killed? That's horrific in its own. No one wants anyone to die, obviously, but you have to understand that the Israeli media and Israeli military and the Israeli government have used these specific gruesome stories which are not confirmed, and as we know now, at least partially invented based on a conservative group's imagination. You know, to say that we have to do certain things a certain way. It's inconceivable that this would be printed in the New York Times, or that they wouldn't. They're standing behind her. They're standing by her. They put out a response. They're standing by her reporting.
Are they really? Because she's under investigation. When did they put this out?
She tweeted it out today, a screenshot from their statement. They're standing by her.
Are you? Because I thought they were just going to scapegoat her, and then we don't look at the top.
No, they're saying the issue was her Twitter likes, not the reporting itself.
That is astounding. I mean, this is clear. Let's look at we've got to look at the ownership of the Times at this point and what influence that they're exerting. We talk about the clear influence of the Murdochs. Here we go, on the Wall Street Journal. But this is like that, related to Israel. I am thankful to the New York Times for standing behind the important stories that we have published. The Times didn't just stand behind me, but also behind the many women whose stories need to be told. How about Palestinian women?
Wait, but hold on though. She didn't tell the many women's stories.
Yes.
Because she didn't speak to the many women who supposedly are involved in these stories. She is telling accounts from, she is not telling those women's stories. She's just not. She's just not. In fact, in that Intercept article, one of the families of one of the women supposedly who was assaulted and then killed, they're saying, based on the text messages they received, they think it is impossible from her when she was still alive. They think it was impossible for her to have gone through what the New York Times is claiming she did.
Yep. Yes.
This is from the family of the actual woman herself. So talk about telling these women stories. They're not even respecting the family's recollection of what their own flesh and blood went through.
That's exactly right. They've been trying to sound the alarm on this as well, in the same way that the hostages' families are being entirely stifled within Israeli society. The families of these victims are also being silenced, and the New York Times in the United States is complicit in this. It just is incredible that they have. I mean, I don't know. This is a massive scandal. This is Judith Miller level, like, propaganda from, the Iraq War, laundering the weapons of mass destruction stuff. But maybe even worse, given how insanely shoddy the reporting is, and the fact that this is the conclusion, seemingly, of their investigation.
No, it's certainly that's certainly correct, and I think that's actually a depressing comparison, because we do look at Judith Miller in the New York Times and the promotion of the war in Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction and all that. We look at that now as for what it was. We teach it in history classes and journalism school as everything that was wrong. Yet to this day, still, there was no accountability. Judith Miller never faced any even career issues with, she never faced any accountability.
She got hired by Fox News.
Right. So, I mean, it's depressing, because that's an absolutely right comparison. We will look back at this moment, and it will be something that is correctly remembered for all its wrongheadedness, I guess you can say, years from now in the history books. Yet everyone involved will continue on. In fact, they'll probably only fail up and continue to get even higher paid, even more influential, cushier jobs.
Yeah, and Gettleman has won a Pulitzer. So, this is the kind of reporting that gets rewarded. The guy that took these folks and perhaps was instrumental, we don't know, in getting them to be those on the ground that were giving him the information for the piece. And I just
you mentioned earlier, I think, this is more of like a journalist career type thing than like a part of the news story here. But I do think it shows that, I think the younger people who are interested in journalism and news, they will no longer look at the New York Times as the goal, like the standard bearer. Like I remember when I broke into journalism, I had an editor who would constantly, bring up like, whenever they would edit something or try to teach me something, the point being would always be that, if your end goal is working somewhere respectable like the New York Times, then, and I would say to them, I don't actually have that as my end goal. I have no career goal in terms of working at the New York Times or any of those big legacy media organizations. In fact, my goal is to somehow one day make a full-time living doing this completely independently.
Right.
I do not want to be beholden to an organization like that. And that was based on my own personal feelings on, for example, the New York Times, partially, like you just mentioned, or for one of the reasons, like you mentioned just earlier, their promotion and of the war in Iraq. And, I think this is going to be a moment like that again. And, with the current state of media, it's going to be rough because these legacy organizations like the Washington Post and the New York Times, they're growing unlike pretty much any other moneyed media outlet out there.
Yeah, everything else is shutting down. And I want to say the Washington Post has actually done, Evan Hill.
They've been. I was just using them as a
Lovejoy. They've been. Yeah. Just wanted to give them credit. They've been so much better than the New York Times on Gaza and Israel.
New York Times has good reporters too. Like I think I think the best way to go about media nowadays is not to look towards a respected outlet. It's to find a specific or multiple specific journalists that you trust and know do solid reporting regardless of wherever they are working or publishing, because they wouldn't put their name on garbage regardless of where it is. So that's what I recommend. Like don't trust an outlet based on the outlet. Trust a story based on who's behind it and their body of work.
Lydia Rose writes in 1922, the Times published its first article about Hitler and downplayed his anti-Semitism, saying it was only to appeal to anti-Semites in Germany. That's a good little tidbit there, Lydia Rose. And let me just end this by saying, as a woman, pulling out that card right now, whoa, watch out, folks. I actually deeply resent this racist usage of sexual violence in order to further dehumanize Palestinians and justify the genocide that's ongoing right now. It is not done in the reverse, even though there have been actually credible reports of sexual violence of women and girls in Israeli custody that have trickled out. But again, journalists have either had to leave Gaza or have been killed for the most part. There are still a few left. But there's no way, and this is on purpose by the Israelis, to verify certain information coming in there and coming out of there because of the fact that they control their borders, land and sea, and they've killed so many people that it's also why the death tolls can't be verified, and they have to come from these outlets will call it, to give a nod to the Israeli lobby, the Hamas-run Palestinian Health Ministry, which has been correct the entire time. They can't be independently verified because all the journalists have been killed or had been forced to leave because they would die if they stayed. So, there have been reports of sexual violence against Palestinian women and girls, but that gets no coverage. Why? Because what the design of this piece was to further dehumanize Palestinians and Hamas, which the Israeli government and Zionists conflate with Palestinians, to paint them as savages, as rapists, as violent, anti-woman, anti-gay, anti-cosmopolitan, anti-Western savages, which is a trope deployed against Arabs and Muslims and has been for my entire life. This is the exact continuation of that kind of dehumanization that we saw the New York Times enable during the Iraq War, and they're continuing to enable it for the Zionist colonial project that is Israel. So please, the idea that they're using the Me Too movement and the increased anxiety around sexual assault to further justify this indiscriminate bombing is like peak kind of capitalist feminism at work, and exactly why we have to oppose it and make sure that feminism, as are all other societal lenses, that it's intersectional and put in context of who gets privileged and who gets humanized in the Western press and who does not. With that, I mean, fun half stuff here, Binder, right? But great job breaking that down with me, because I thought it was super important, to be honest.
Yeah, it's great reporting from Intercept that they found that. And,
I know.
One thing that struck me, actually, and I don't remember if I there's been so much that's happened in these past few months. I don't recall if I did read this and just simply, I overlooked it or forgot about it, or if it's something I just didn't see at all. But early on in that piece, they have this point made about how in the New York Times, they had a long-standing, sort of rule where they didn't refer to Hamas as a terrorist organization because it wasn't a stateless actor. It's actually, the official government of Gaza. And then after October 7th, they actually, I don't know if they forced him out or he felt like he needed to resign because of changes going on. But the person who was standing by that rule, they no longer had that position, and they changed that rule to, that guideline to no longer refer to them as, how they've done so. And I mean, listen, for as long as I've been following this, which has been a while now, way before October 7th, obviously, years and years and years, there was that fundamental difference between Hamas and what we perceived as terrorist organizations in the Middle East in general. Like, because Hamas is a state actor. It is the government of the region. There are, parts of Hamas that we would look at like other governments. There are legitimate like lawmakers and politicians and, things like that. And then there was this like more militant area of part of Hamas, which people would then use to paint the whole group as a terrorist organization. There was that fundamental difference, and that wasn't just from far left or whatever. That was something that the U.S. government even viewed, and the Israeli government even viewed as the fundamental difference, because they worked had contacts with Hamas that they would work with.
Yeah. Well, we all know that, too, that Netanyahu was instrumental in allowing Hamas to be funded because he saw Hamas as an asset as opposed to, the more secular parties in Palestine, because he could demonize them as a terrorist organization and continue to justify killing them.